There we go. Okay. Hello, welcome to our presentation on self-actualization and eco-martyrs. This was a presentation that was initially intended for the Division 32 annual conference that was to be held in New Orleans in March. As you probably know, that was canceled due to COVID-19. So we're so thankful that Division 32, Society for Humanistic Psychology, is allowing us to sort of make it up in this format during the APA as part of the Division 32 Hospitality Suite. And just to give you a little background on the purpose of this talk was 1 year ago, it's hard to imagine, 1 year ago we were in person in Chicago for the APA, and my students who have been investigating eco-martyrs, we're going to have a definition of that here in a little bit, but in general it's someone trying to protect the environment that has been mostly assassinated. Sometimes people have died accidentally, but mostly assassinated. And we had a poster about self-actualization and eco-martyrdom, where some of my former students, none of them are actually still here, they've graduated and moved on, but they were presenting, and Dr. Bland was listening to their presentation, and one of the students made a comment that is kind of a common misconception about Maslow and his concept of self-actualization, and it's a common misconception, and Dr. Bland gave a little corrective criticism to them, some feedback which they very much appreciated, and came back to and told me about, you know, some of the constructive criticism that they had received. So what we decided, now those folks are gone, but this group of students have all decided that we were going to take up the challenge of looking into the misconception that we had made and investigate that. And in fact, we are working on 2 separate papers on that. My team is entirely undergraduates. And so we end up finding a paper that talks about a lot of the misconceptions that people have about Maslow. And we're actually going to share those with you today after we kind of give you a little background. So Johanna's going to start us out with a little bit of background about what we've been doing. Then Alan is going to talk a little bit about a definition that we've developed about what an eco-martyr is. Rachel will then be sharing one story of a particular eco-martyr. Some people consider the first eco-martyr in the modern era, Chico Mendes. And then we're going to go through those misconceptions that we found in a paper and just talk about each one of them. So Kelly will go and do the first couple misconceptions, then William will do the middle group, and then Christopher will come back and finish those up, and then Johanna will give a conclusion and hand it over to Dr. Bland so that he can make some comments about what we have shared, and you know, in a sense, we wanted to invite him here to say thank you to him for, you know, pushing us in the right direction. And we also wanted to show that we took up that very seriously. And we have indeed found that we as researchers had a misconception that we have corrected, and we appreciate him taking the time to both be here now, but also to steer us in the right direction. And that's what science is supposed to do. It corrects its own mistakes, and we feel good about the fact that we are in the process of correcting something that we said that was incorrect. So let's get started, and we'll start with Johanna.
Hello everyone, my name is Johanna Guz-Montegomery. Thank you for joining us for our presentation on self-actualization and eco-martyrs. For the last several years, our research group has been studying individuals who have been killed while advocating for the environment in some way, whether that be fighting against illegal mining, illegal land grabbing, poaching. Some of these forms of environmental destruction we as researchers had never even heard of, and yet these eco-martyrs are being murdered for it by people who are attempting to profit off of this destruction. Every year, Global Witness, an organization, Global Witness, publishes a list of the names of people who have been murdered while advocating for the environment. We take that list and we use it to write short summaries about each of these martyrs' lives, about what they fought for and what they ultimately died for. Since 2002, over 2,000 names have been listed by Global Witness. While we were writing these summaries, we started to notice that a lot of these eco-martyrs exhibited characteristics that Maslow would describe as being someone who's self-actualized, and yet their basic needs were not being met. What some people refer to as their lower level needs were not being met. Many of them didn't have access to clean water. They didn't have access to food. Their safety needs were not being met. They were facing violence. They were facing being removed from their homelands. And many of them were also not from well-developed industrialized nations. So we were starting to wonder if perhaps Abraham Maslow's concept of self-actualization could still apply to these individuals, even though they had not met their lower level needs. Traditionally, people view Maslow's hierarchy of needs as being a step-by-step progression. You have to achieve the lower needs to achieve self-actualization. Since these individuals obviously could not achieve the lower needs, could self-actualization still apply to them? This curiosity led us to study a lot of common misunderstandings around Maslow's work with self-actualization. In 2018, Compton compiled a list of what he saw as 9 common misconceptions about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. So Alan Lankford and Rachel Creed will begin our presentation by describing eco-martyrs and giving an example of one of our eco-martyrs. And then Kelly Rios Santos, William Purrington, and Christopher Lazaret will take over by describing the 9 common misconceptions listed by Compton. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alan Lankford. I'm going to give a brief definition of what an eco-martyr is. Now, a martyr is a person who dies for a superpersonal cause. What do we mean by superpersonal? Well, what we mean is something that's beyond the immediate concrete experience of the individual and his kin and family. We mean a project, a social movement, a meaning that benefits an entire community, an entire people, or even humanity as a whole. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a martyr is a person who undergoes death or great suffering on behalf of a faith or cause. Now, there's nothing negative in this definition, but what is unquestionable is that martyrdom has taken on a very negative connotation in the West, particularly since the 9/11 attacks. It's been increasingly equated with suicide bombing. Thus, most research in psychology on martyrdom is concerned with fine-tuning de-radicalization programs and basically looking for a way to squelch the impulse to martyrdom. Although this research is no doubt important, we feel that it also allows violent fundamentalists to control the discourse of martyrdom and to equate martyrdom to suicide bombing when we believe they're 2 distinct constructs. What we've done is sought out the positive elements of self-sacrifice and martyrdom. And in doing so, we've developed a working definition of what an eco-martyr is. We note 5 characteristics of an eco-martyr. The first is altruistic instead of egotistical self-sacrifice. Now, the delineation between altruistic on one hand and egotistical on the other hand, self-sacrifice, is something that goes back to the philosopher Friedrich Schiller. So egotistical self-sacrifice is when the temporal self is negated only to gratify the eternal self. So if you think of a suicide bomber seeking to kill himself simply so he will be rewarded in heaven, that would be a perfect example of egotistical self-sacrifice. And really, when you think about it, it's more of a transaction than it is self-sacrifice at all. And most importantly, in egotistical self-sacrifice, death is the goal. The martyr is seeking his own goal, seeking to die. Altruistic self-sacrifice, however, is when the person doesn't even come into the equation. It's all about the cause. The martyr is not seeking out death as much as accepting death as an unfortunate consequence of their total definition to the dedication to the cause. So altruistic martyrdom, it admits no self-interest and no secondary gain whatsoever on the temporal plane or the eternal plane. Secondly, martyrs demonstrate counter-final goal commitment. This comes from the work of Eric Kruglanski, and very simply what it means is when the realization of one ultimate goal precludes and overrides all other personal goals. So death would certainly be an example here, but so would any of the other tremendous personal sacrifices a martyr has to take on. They really have to give up any hope of like personal comfort, of getting ahead in a career, often even of like safety for their family. It all comes down to that one ultimate cause, the one ultimate goal. These martyrs are people who are so committed to their ultimate goal that all ordinary and mundane concerns fall by the wayside. This dovetails nicely with our third aspect, which is that martyrs demonstrate the characteristics of Maslow's self-actualization and Frankel's self-transcendence. Frankel, of course, believed that, quote, the striving to find meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. Maslow agreed with this and added that in his studies of self-actualizing individuals, he found that, quote, in all cases, they are motivated by a cause or calling beyond themselves. But eco-martyrs are more than committed to a cause or calling. They become that cause. Returning to the work of Ari Kruglanski, and what he termed the significance quest, this is where a martyr finds their meaning and merges with it. So first, the martyr loses significance, becomes aware of their total insignificance in the cosmos. Often this is a friend or family member dying or losing their homeland. They then go out on the significance quest, where they regain it by identifying with a cause or a movement that will never die. So they're no longer insignificant because they're merged with this movement. This is something called the collectivist shift, and it leads to a state called identity fusion. The self and the cause are not seen separately. What's good for the cause is good for the self. This presupposes an existing separation between self and environment, between person and society. This fifth characteristic, the ecological self, is where the eco part of eco-martyr comes in. This comes from the work of Fred Besthorn. He writes that division between self and other, person and society, is not to be taken for granted. It's actually something very historically recent and is confined mostly to the Western Enlightenment tradition. He defines this binary division between the person and the environment as the philosophy of anthropocentrism. And this is the thought that humans are the center of the universe, specifically Western civilized humans are the center of the universe, and the environment exists solely for them to exploit it. Fred Besthorn writes, and I personally agree that this philosophy has led to untold ecological devastation and immiseration, exploitation on an industrial scale. What he argues is the answer to this is not something new, but something very old. It's what he terms the ecological self, and it's the way that traditional and indigenous communities have always viewed the world. And this is a worldview in which self and environment are not separate. What's good for the environment is good for the self. With the ecological self, Martyrdom isn't a mystery. There's no contradiction between individual goals and social movements. For eco-martyrs, a quest for personal significance and a quest for collective survival are indistinguishable. Now to present the story of one such eco-martyr, slain trade unionist Chico Mendes, I'll pass it over to Rachel Creed.
Hi, my name is Rachel Creed, and based on our definition of an eco-martyr, I conducted a case study on Chico Mendes, who many do consider to be one of the world's first eco-martyrs. Chico Mendes was from a state called Acre in Brazil, and Acre, there is an abundance of latex and rubber trees. Traditionally, the trees would be cut with machetes and then drained for the rubber and latex, and then left to heal over the next season, so none of the trees would ever have to be cut down. The people who drained these trees were known as rubber tappers, and they went on harvesting the rubber this way for hundreds of years before roughly the 1970s and 1980s, when a lot of wealthy landowners began to move to Acre and purchased large plots of land in order to log it and develop it into cattle ranches, which entailed kicking a lot of the indigenous peoples off of their native lands where they had lived and worked for generations. Chico Mendes was a rubber tapper himself, and he developed several labor unions in order to protect not only the rubber tappers in his community, but to protect the Amazon rainforest, because he knew that it was considered the lungs of the earth, and that if that was cut down, the rest of the earth would suffer as a consequence. Through his labor unions, Chico Mendes was able to develop education for the local rubber tappers and teach them how to band together to peacefully resist the deforestation and destruction of their communities. He was also able to develop co-ops, acquire medical resources, and he even invented the peaceful protest method of the empate, which is essentially when a large group of people would gather together and hold hands in front of the forest and essentially block the bulldozers or chainsaws that were attempting to log it. And while they were doing that, another group of people would go to the international presses and get all of the appropriate laws together, pressure on the Brazilian government that way in order to stop the logging from the inside. While they were doing this, Chico Mendes was also able to mend the rubber tappers' relationship with local Indian tribes. The rubber tappers in Acre and the Indian tribes had had a dispute amongst one another for hundreds of years before Chico Mendes actually called a meeting between him and the local Indian tribe leaders and explained to them that the dispute amongst them was neither of their faults, but it was actually the wealthy landowners' faults for not only taking advantage of them and their labors, but exploiting all of their natural resources. And not only did that end the dispute between the rubber tappers and the local Indian tribes, they actually joined the movement and the labor unions and participated side by side in peaceful protests under Chico Mendes' leadership in order to defend their homelands as a group. Now, while this was going on, landowners were attempting to stop the labor unionists by hiring gunmen in order to occupy the towns and murder whoever they needed to in order to stop the unionists from happening. And this all came to a head after Chico Mendes was able to save roughly 16,000 acres of land from being logged by a wealthy landowner known as Darli Alves da Silva. He was intending to turn this land into a giant cattle ranch, but the problem was that there were about 60 indigenous families who were living on his land at the time. Chico Mendes actually was able to get all of those families together in peaceful protest and reach out to the Brazilian government, and they had that entire plot of land turned into an extractive reserve, which essentially made the land public, and the families who still lived there were able to continue living there, and anybody who wanted to could come and tap the trees for rubber, but nobody could outright own all of the land. Nobody could cut down any of the trees, which was great. But however, Darli Alves da Silva was incredibly upset from losing this land, and he wanted to take revenge on Chico for this. Only a few months after the land was turned into an extractive reserve, Chico Mendes was murdered by one of Darli Alves da Silva's gunmen. At the time of his death, Chico Mendes had saved roughly 100,000 hectares of land from deforestation. Chico Mendes was aware that he was going to be killed. he knew who would do it and he knew why. He even wrote Darli Alves de Silva's name in his memoirs saying that this is the man who is probably going to kill me. But he didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was protecting his community, protecting the rubber tappers, protecting the Amazon rainforest and the earth as a whole. And he knew that even if he died, the movement would continue on without him, and that's what really mattered to him. And because of this, we believe that Chico Mendes is an exemplary prototype for our definition of an eco-martyr. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Rios Santos. I will be introducing the first 3 common misconceptions that surround Maslow. The first common misconception is that there is no empirical support for Maslow, and we've found time and time again through our research that this just isn't the case. It's acknowledged within the literature that it has become somewhat of a tradition to say that there is no support for Maslow, but as we've read through, we've found many articles supporting Maslow, many articles that have found significant relationships between other established theories such as Kohlberg's theory, Erikson's stages. We have also found that the articles that tend to not support Maslow seem to fundamentally misunderstand him and tend to use his theories for things that, things that they're not meant for, or they seem to just not understand him. Maslow and other early humanistic psychologists also predicted the development of developmental psychology, and this prediction is in and of itself empirical support for Maslow. He himself was very vocal about criticisms levied at him, and he himself said it was very important to be empirical and also expand on the theory. The second misconception surrounding Maslow would be that to move through his theory, to move to self-actualization, one has to move in a lockstep fashion. And Maslow himself said that this is not the case. He said that to conceptualize his theory is more in a set of percentages, decreasing as you move towards self-actualization. Everyone is partially fulfilled and unfulfilled in all of these percentages at the same time. So while you may decrease in a lower level, this does not mean that you are unable to reach self-actualization. He himself did not create this pyramid, but rather other psychologists have used it to explain his theory, which makes it one of the most difficult misconceptions to dispel, because this is often the first exposure psychology students have to the theory. Moving on to the third misconception. The third misconception surrounding Maslow is that cognitive and aesthetic needs should be included in the pyramid. Maslow himself said that these two needs work better in their own hierarchy as a synergistic supporting role to his self-actualization theory. They are a set of tools that often are used for other things aside from basic needs. But Maslow did speak about B values, also known as being values, when describing self-actualized people. And these being values do have aesthetic qualities such as beauty and aliveness. So in a way, these aesthetic needs are included in his self-actualization theory indirectly. Thank you.
Hello, my name is William Purrington, and I'll be going through the common misconceptions 4 through 6. So the fourth common misconception puts forth that those who are self-actualizing are also self-centered, an idea which is debunked by Maslow's own work. Specifically, he puts forth that self-actualizing individuals demonstrate, among other features, kindness, courage, love, and unselfishness. They're often focused on dealing with larger societal and national problems, which affect not just them, but the people around them, usually the community that they live in. They're generally more loving of other people, and they have a strong sense of community, which helps motivate them to address these, large-scale societal problems for the sake of making wide-reaching changes to positively impact the lives not just of friends and family, but of their general wider community around them. The fifth common misconception is that self-actualization is at the top of the hierarchy of needs. In Maslow's original 15 characteristics of self-actualization, he had a concept known as the mystical experience. The mystical experience basically dealt with ideas and concepts beyond the typical scope of human experience. So while a normal person might be concerned with their place in society, in the mystical experience, one would be more concerned with their place in the wider cosmos. It's more of a philosophical perspective. Later in life, Maslow went into more detail on the mystical experience, splitting it up into two levels: peakers and non-peakers, both of whom are self-actualizing people. But while a peaker could be considered perhaps your typical self-actualizing individual, or sorry, non-peakers could be considered that, a peaker is concerned with more mystical matters. So they typically are more transcendental, they have transpersonal experiences, and they see the sacred in everything, versus a non-peaker who does not. The sixth misconception has to do with Maslow and science. Specifically, it's put forth that Maslow rejects scientific theory and the use of science and psychology in general. Now, this misconception appears to come from a criticism by Maslow of a tendency among researchers to specifically just rely on objective research and empirical research, and the procedures and methods and techniques which go into performing that research, instead of also focusing on understanding the question that you're asking, the participants you're working with, not just in terms of how that participant applies to the question, but also understanding them as a human being. Now, even though he is critical of objective research and empirical research, he doesn't discount it. He doesn't think it's not important. Instead, he thinks you should understand this more subjective angle of research first, understanding the question, understanding the participant, and then move on to the objective empirical research. And this is something which is supported by Maslow's tendency in his life to push for empirical research on his own studies, to improve on them, and to criticize them, find support, or find something that's wrong with his work so he can improve on it in the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Lotzrat. I will be going over the 7th, 8th, and 9th common misconceptions of Maslow. The 7 misconceptions surrounding the self-actualization theory is that it is often thought to be elitist due to its Western roots. Though it is rooted in a Western ideology, it does allow people of all backgrounds to be able to reach self-actualization. It acknowledges the unique obstacles people of different socioeconomic backgrounds may face. Only when viewing the theory on its own is the elitist misconception reached, something Dr. Bland and Dr. De Robertis point to as contributing to the negative treatment that Maslow has received in recent decades from sociocultural-minded researchers. As further shown by Dr. Bland and Dr. De Robertis, Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been tested in various places across the world. And these studies' results have lent credence to the universality of the hierarchy of needs and dampened the idea that it can only be applied to Western subject groups. The 8th misconception is that the sampling of participants for Maslow's self-actualization studies has been characterized as containing only white to upper middle class individuals. Now, the sample was chosen purposefully to exemplify self-actualization, and though Maslow did personally select it, it features individuals that are well respected by a myriad of people such as historians, theologians, philosophers, psychologists, politicians. Not only were those chosen of different professions and classes, but there were also different races and ethnicities in his sample. In his 1950s study, this included people like Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman, and Pablo Casals. Maslow acknowledged the obstacles presented to various groups of people in reaching self-actualization, understanding that different people have unique trials they have to face to reach it. Lastly, the final myth that Compton dispelled is the idea that self-actualized people are happier than others. Maslow did not mention happiness as a trait of self-actualized people and did not think that happiness is brought on simply by fulfilling needs and desires. Dr. Bland and Dr. Robertis report that Maslow's definition of self-actualizing individuals included the ability to express negative emotions in a healthy manner, and that they are still capable of harboring resentment towards others. So while self-actualizing brings with it a suite of positive factors and emotions, it is not an all-powerful cancellation of the negative aspects of life for a person. Instead, it makes it easier for these people to handle negative emotions in a positive manner and ensures that they will not develop into, for example, unhealthy obsessions or desires that end up impeding a person's ability to function safely. Now, one of our concerns is that many of the researchers criticizing Maslow seem to want to alter his theory for their own purposes. In other words, researchers want to use the hierarchy for reasons which it was not intended for, such as evaluating nation-state development, putting parenting and mating at the top of the hierarchy of needs, or plainly altering it to fit their views further. The desire to apply the hierarchy of needs outside of its originally intended usage makes use of its widely recognized nature as a good tool for conveying a point. And the clear escalation of the needs as the hierarchy is climbed makes a good template for application to other subjects. However, the hierarchy of needs was designed with individuals in mind, and that is extremely difficult for the criteria of the needs to be factors that can be reliably measured, such as in the context of nation states. The nature of the hierarchy of needs itself also causes some of the drive to alter it, with different fields of psychology inherently having varied opinions on the order of the hierarchy and even on what specifically should be in it. Thank you.
We feel strongly that we have shown that Maslow's concept of self-actualization and the hierarchy of needs is still relevant and useful in contemporary society. Self-actualized people, they're not self-centered, privileged, socioeconomic elitists. You know, it's not supposed to be separated into people who can afford to be self-actualized because they can meet their basic needs and people who can't afford it and therefore can't be self-actualized. Self-actualization is flexible. It can apply to a variety of people in different countries, in different cultures, people with different upbringings. An eco-martyr is someone who actively attempted to protect people, to protect other beings, our Earth, from environmental destruction, and ultimately were killed by people who were trying to profit off of that destruction. We feel that we have shown that our eco-martyrs, regardless of their location, of their status, were able to be self-actualized regardless of their meeting their basic needs or not. They still exhibited self-actualization. We would now like to turn this over to Dr. Bland. We're honored for Dr. Bland to be joining us today, and we thank him for being here.
Thank you, guys. Well, before I begin, I just want to say what a wonderful job all of you have done as far as really addressing a lot of these misconceptions about Maslow, and especially in the interest of setting the stage for really just a lot of the application of Maslow and of humanistic psychology in general to meet the challenges of our current era and our current times. You brought up numbers of points, and so of course with time being limited, I'm only going to be able to address a few of them, but certainly during the discussion we can go into more. But just to follow up on some of these is, so starting off with the research piece, indeed Maslow was very much of an empirical researcher. If you're not familiar, one of his advisors along the way was Edward Thorndike, so I'm not sure you can get too much more empirical than that. In addition to that, he had done a lot of research during his doctoral years and also his postdoctoral years with basically observing what was known in those days as dominance behavior. These days, it's basically better known as self-esteem, as well as sexuality, particularly in women. He also had done a number of, and a lot of those, by the way, those studies really greatly informed his concept of self-esteem that went into the needs hierarchy later. And one of the big things that really got him thinking beyond just experimental science, but also really looking into other possibilities, was getting out of the laboratory and the psychological laboratory and having kids. And then he realized that raising 2 children isn't exactly the same thing as what occurs in a laboratory experiment most days. And so that really got him thinking into what William James or Rollo May have referred to as the humanistic tradition in psychology being more empirical than traditional empirical science, psychological science. And with that in mind, one of the big things that Maslow really proposed is what is known now these days as a dynamic systems model. In those days, they didn't have that terminology yet. He referred to it in his day as a holistic dynamic model, but it's basically the same thing. And what he was proposing essentially, and you guys did a great job of overviewing this, is looking at the, and also this goes into the idea of the needs hierarchy being hierarchical, but not being this lockstep progression, like a stage model. You have to have this before you get to this. Instead, really what Maslow was getting at, was basically trying to propose more of a social justice side in psychology. I'm going to go down a little bit of a different path for a moment just to illustrate this point, but a couple of you mentioned this idea of, let's say, for example, that, and I'm pretty much paraphrasing Maslow here greatly, but let's say that you have a person whose physiological needs have been met, say, 30% of the time. We could assume then that their safety needs have probably been met about 20% of the time. Their belonging needs have probably been met about 10%, self-esteem about 5%, and then from there, self-actualizing probably about 1%, right? And then let's just say from the standpoint of, for example, generational poverty, if we were to help put a child or an adult, either way, in touch with appropriate resources so that those physiological needs are not being met only 30% of the time, but say 80% of the time, then with that, we could assume that safety needs will probably go up from 20 to about 50 or 60, and that belonging would probably go from, what did I say earlier, 10 up to about 50 or so, and so forth and so on. And then from there, the ability to self-actualize, or basically to take on healthy challenges and to go beyond one's comfort zone, then becomes much greater, as opposed to just staying homeostatically clinging homeostatically to the familiar and just what one knows, as disappointing as that outcome might be. And with that too, earlier, Alan, I think you'd mentioned the idea of self-sacrifice. And with that, the idea that really we could conceptualize Maslow's needs hierarchy as when a person's primary needs are met less of the time consistently, then you are going to be seeing a lot more egocentrism. Whereas when they've been met consistently, more consistently, then it's more likely that you're going to be setting the stage for a greater degree of other directedness and interdependence and so forth, which is where the eco-martyr piece comes in. And so putting all that together, Maslow's idea of science was very much of a both-and approach. He never once eschewed quantitative or experimental science at all. He often said, I'm a behaviorist, and I'm a psychoanalyst, and I'm a humanist. It was very much of a both-and model. And connecting that to the idea of the importance of research for Maslow, in one of his journals in, I believe, 1962, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically expressed a lot of concern about the fact that by that time in the culture in the United States, that his ideas were being basically taken up lock, stock, and barrel. And he pretty much predicted everything that's happened ever since then. He pretty much said that, wait a minute, if people just take up my ideas uncritically and without really putting them to the test, then 50 years from now, people are just aren't going to listen to them anymore because there's going to be all kinds of reasons not to. And I hate to say it, but that's kind of what's happened here. On the other hand, he was also very much of a proponent of the idea of integration of methods, both quantitative and qualitative. You have to remember, too, that phenomenology, just as one example, was barely getting off the ground when he died in 1970. Putting both quantitative and qualitative together, there are numerous examples out there of, and by the way, several of you had cited these in the report that you presented. But just to add one more recent publication is Scott Barry Kaufman's, I don't know if you can see this or not, book Transcend. which basically goes further in terms of really taking a lot of the principles of Maslow and of psychological health as conceptualized by Maslow, self-actualizing and self-transcending and so forth. And also the lower ends of the hierarchy as well, and really just does a really nice job of providing further empirical support really for those ideas. And also a lot of concepts and constructs and principles that are very much part of psychology, just mainstream psychology today, that really have a lot of their roots in the humanistic movement. With that in mind as well, one of the nice things that the book also focuses on very well is Maslow's focus a lot on paradox and the eudaimonic, let's just call it that. The idea that, as a couple of you were mentioning, the idea of happiness. It's not so much about happiness, but rather about the idea of fulfillment. There is a difference between the two. And that the more that we can confront the paradoxes in life, that the more likely we are to be able to feel a greater sense of fulfillment. As a therapist, I see this all the time in my work, and also in working with students whom I supervise. The idea of being able to just rise to a challenge, and when the process goes well, it's not an easy thing, but after a while, a person can look back and say, okay, it might not have been fun, but I had to go through all of that to get to where I am now. And so with that, the thing that I would encourage just everyone to consider, both you all as well as just others who might be viewing this on YouTube later, on SHTV later, first and foremost, the absolute importance of reading primary text and not just going with summaries of summaries of summaries. What I've referred to along the way is the academic telephone game. Everybody remembers the old game of telephone, right? I whisper in Christopher's ear, and then by the time he gets back around to me, after everybody else, it's not going to be the same message anymore. There's a lot of that out there. So reading primary text, first you're going to find them a lot more interesting, but also probably a lot more accurate. And in addition to that, when reading a lot of these primary texts, it's also important to know one's history of psychology as well. For example, Maslow was really pointing to a lot of things, usually a lot more descriptively, because in those days there weren't terms yet or constructs that now we just say something like eudaimonic, and most people usually tend to understand what that means because it's gotten incorporated into the field, or experiential avoidance or something like that. These are things that are much more commonly known these days. Those terms weren't around when Maslow was writing a lot of this stuff in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. And so with that in mind, just keep that in mind. Also, what we now refer to as secure attachment and authoritative parenting, a lot of those things also hadn't come around yet, but basically that's what he was really calling for from a developmental perspective as far as what sets the stage for the greater possibility of self-actualizing. But even then, it's not that simplistic either, because it's not as deterministic as only one's parenting, or the parenting style and the attachment style that one received. There have been, going back to the dynamic systems model again, there is a lot of research that's been coming out in recent years that very much provides evidence for the idea that one can really come from a terribly difficult background. Maslow, by the way, as a side note, was one of those people. And then all it takes is having one really good friend during middle school, adolescence, early adult, college age, and so forth, to overturn all those other years and to develop a sense of resilience and so forth. And then with that, that 30% to 80% or whatever that I mentioned earlier, there's a much greater possibility of that. And then also to keep in mind that a lot of the methodologies that we now regard as more, let's just call them commonplace, not only qualitatively, but also quantitatively, weren't around in Maslow's day. In those days, pretty much all you had was basic hypothesis testing using ANOVAs and stuff like that. They didn't have structural equation modeling yet. I'm sorry, switching quickly off of Maslow to Rogers. Rogers did indeed use some basically earlier versions of what's now known as structural equation modeling, using Q-sorts and things like that in some of his work. But even then, those methods were still pretty primitive by today's standards. But back to Maslow again. The other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to the idea of self-actualizing overall, that Maslow did use the term self-actualization quite a bit. But if you read his writings carefully, you'll notice that he didn't really talk very much about self-actualized people, but rather he very much conceptualized self-actualization as a verb as opposed to a noun, and really talked about it that way very consistently in his writings. To use much more colloquial terms, we never really get there. It's an ongoing process. And I think that's, at the end of the day, what Maslow was really on about in his theorizing, is the idea that, and also a lot of the research that he did to support that, is the idea of bringing in much more of an idea of process for psychology to really be the human science that it can be, as opposed to looking strictly at outcomes. Well done, guys.
Well, thank you very much for responding to us and offering those thoughts. I think one of the great things our team did learn is when you go back to the original sources and you really dig into Maslow, there is a lot to admire. I mean, his basic philosophy of science is really, he's very humble. He's not, he realizes that, this is not to be reified self-actualization. I think that's, I don't know if Alan found this great quote, but it basically says something to the fact that almost like self-actualization is almost like enlightenment. You can't try too hard to be it. Right? It's paradoxically sort of, the more you want to be self-actualized, the more you kind of push it away. Just like the more someone wants to be enlightened, it seems to elude them. And so one of our conclusions is that this idea has become reified, and oddly enough, now people have this drive to be self-actualized, and the beauty of what he discovered, it has now become a destination rather than for people, rather than the journey that I think he recognized it to be. So
very, very much so, Dr. Bargdill. Just to add to that, as you were saying that, one thing that came to mind was the old adage that if you hear somebody tell you that they're wise, run, right?
All right. Same with self-actualization, right?
Bingo.
Did we have, did any of our other folks have a comment or question for Dr. Bland, or wanted to say something?
I had a quick question, if that's okay. I was just curious, Dr. Bland, where do you believe that the fault lies within these misconceptions surrounding Maslow's work? Do you believe that it's Maslow's writing that lends itself to be misinterpretable, or do you think it comes from the individual researchers who are reading it who just sort of misinterpret it?
That's an important question. And before I respond, I just wanted to mention just one other thing really quickly, is I wanted to apologize to everybody for not calling you by name earlier. I know I did a couple of times, but admittedly, I just kind of lost track of who said what. So I apologize for that. But back to your question, I would be inclined to say it really comes from a number of places. I'm just going to pick two for right now, and then I would certainly be willing to chat with you a little bit later on just to add to this. One area is what I would just call that academic telephone game once again. It's something that happens. We can't all read every single book that everybody wrote, or else we would never get through a semester being able to get past Freud, right? So there's definitely condensation and compression and summaries and that sort of thing. Back to the idea of the pyramid once again. Maslow certainly alluded to, or I'm sorry, he definitely talked about a hierarchical organization. And it is true that at times he may have alluded to a pyramid. I'll come back to that point in a moment, but in a very, very different context. Let me actually just table that idea for a moment, and I'll come back to it. But in general, I think what happened as far as the pyramid getting into textbooks is it's a very simple way for especially beginners to be able to wrap their minds around this stuff, right? So someone just kind of drew it up one day and then stuck it in a textbook. And the next thing you know, that gets repeated and repeated, and there you go. I think another major portion of all of this is that, to be fair to Maslow, he was very well received in his time. It's important to remember he was elected president of APA in 1968. And by the way, that was by somebody else's nomination. He had very little to do with any of that. He didn't promote himself or anything like that. And he actually was very tempted to actually forego that presidency, mainly because he had a lot of other things going on at that time. His health was also deteriorating, so he knew that his time was limited. But he really saw it as a good opportunity to get some of these ideas out, right? So that kind of leads to my next point, which is that let's also look at this from the standpoint of creativity theory and creativity research. Is any strong idea, and when I say strong, I just mean something that's usually sustainable and lasting, something we regard as classic later, usually is not always necessarily the best received at the beginning, because it usually tends to defy the zeitgeist, and it defies the field and so forth, to use Sternberg's language, and also defies oneself while one is at it. That's self-actualizing there, is it not? So the idea here is that I think that it was enough of a challenge that there were some people who absolutely loved what he was on about. There were others who absolutely hated what he was on about, and were doing everything they possibly could to maintain the status quo. And then that all gets carried forward and wash, rinse, and repeat. Now, just really quickly back to the idea of what Maslow did say about a pyramid is one of my mentors in my graduate program, Mike Ahrens, was actually a student of Maslow's in the mid-60s. And he told me once that where Maslow did talk about a pyramid in his classroom is when he was teaching a course on what was called then the good society. We would now call it more eupsychia, which is a term that Maslow coined basically to talk about what would a psychologically healthy society really look like, and what would be the qualities. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm keeping this very, very, very brief here. But he basically would ask students to whip out a dollar bill. And you know that little pyramid on the back of the dollar bill where it has another pyramid lifted off it just a little bit, and there's the opening of the eye? Well, Maslow used that as a metaphor for understanding the process of self-actualizing and growth. That basically more of our survival-oriented needs and more existential needs are rooted on the ground, right? And then more of the transpersonal stuff is toward the top. And then when we're able to self-transcend, we literally kind of lift off of that. We're able to rise above whatever challenges that we're facing. We open the eye, both in terms of awakening, but also in terms of moving out of egocentrism and into more interdependence. Who constitutes the self that constitutes me, right? And then from there, another pyramid comes out of that. And then that sets the stage for the next part of one's life. And then one eventually outgrows that and keeps going. So you could kind of think of it as, you know, those Russian nesting dolls where you have a whole bunch of dolls that kind of build into each other. You could think of it as kind of an inverse of that, where it starts small and then outgrows itself, and outgrows itself. So that's when Maslow did talk about a pyramid, that was really more of the way he conceptualized it.
Any other comments or questions? Because I know we're coming to the end of our time here, but if we had one more, that may be, Kelly, do you have?
I have one question. I was wondering, since we know that we have all these misconceptions that they tend to start pretty early on in our psych education.
Oh, you betcha.
Yeah, how do you think we could move forward knowing this to more correct this from the very beginning?
It's an important question. And what I would be willing to say is that what we're doing right now is a step in that direction. Is not rudely, not in a intellectually sophisticated, think the comic book guy, I'm sorry, intellectually unsophisticated, think comic book guy on The Simpsons sort of manner, where the guy just goes in and tries to show off how much he doesn't know by trying to show off how much he does know. But rather, just first off, publishing, doing presentations like this, and then just as we see them, just kind of pulling people gently aside, just saying, you know, I noticed that you'd said this, but let me also just kind of give you a little bit of a perspective here. And just kind of using that question to bring things full circle. I mean, that's basically what occurred last year when I watched, when I heard Dr. Bargdill's students. I was telling Dr. Bargdill on a phone call recently, I was very, very impressed with the humility of the students who were working on the project last year, with the idea that they were basically saying, wow, I didn't know that. I wasn't familiar with that. Thank you. And then they went forward and did some work to really try to change things. And that happens all the time in learning. We don't ever get it right the first time. And again, it's almost impossible to really be able to read everything and to be familiar with everything. But the more that we can maintain our own sense of humility and so forth, I think all the better as well. But to your point, and also going back to your question, what I would be willing to say is also just the more that we can do in the way of, again, developing presentations like this, and also just publishing more and more articles like this. I'm actually working on one at the moment with Eugene de Robertis, who's the person who I wrote the developmental article with. And he and I are also talking about eventually trying to send something. Now, this is a pipe dream at this point, but down the line, eventually maybe sending something to American psychologists and just saying, look, you know, this is something that really needs to be talked about. And of course, it's not just us. Compton is doing it. You guys are doing it.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the beautiful things about this, I think, is that you did pull our students aside, and they appreciated that, and it led to this, and this is why we put this on. And I think it's just a great lesson for all researchers is, you know, when someone offers you, you know, an idea or a correction, take it seriously. Don't feel embarrassed, but listen to it, you know, dig in, do some work. And anytime you do some work, there's a benefit from it, right? And, you know, I think as we kind of draw this to a conclusion that this is how science is supposed to work, that it's not mistake-free. You know, no one gets it right all the time, but if you can learn from your mistakes, you're just going to be a better scientist.
And to add to that, it really also raises the question of what is an error, what is a mistake when we really think about it, because it's only when we continue to repeat the same mistakes over and over that things are really a problem. Otherwise, it's a great opportunity for learning and for growth.
Absolutely. Why don't we end there? Thank you all for being with us.